Hello, friends from all over. It's really great to have your company today. Thanks for joining me to talk about not only the science of reading, but how we can connect that knowledge base to what we know about the cognitive principles of how we all learn. So let's get into it. Okay, so here's our big question for today. How can we ensure or guarantee that the instruction we use in our contexts and with the students we serve actually helps every student develop, and not just develop, but apply their reading skills across content areas and across the school day? The learning sciences can really help us to not just understand best instructional practices, but actually respond to all the variabilities in the learners that we seek to serve and help meet successful learning outcomes. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is what can we learn from the learning sciences that really helps us to respond to learner variability with practical strategies and responsive moves that support our students in becoming not only independent readers, but independent learners across the content areas. So throughout our time today, we'll discuss recent advances in the science of reading and factors that we know are critical to reading outcomes. So we'll make sure we're just keeping up to date on that research base. We'll also dive into what the science of learning and that research base says about the cognitive skills that are foundational to the ways we all learn. And then we'll shift into applying all of that knowledge to the practical business of working with teachers and students in all of these different places that we live across the world. So we'll look a little more closely at how we, from our vantage points, either as curriculum developers, as school administrators, as educators, wherever you're coming from today, how you can apply this knowledge to better serve all students in your context. But first, my friends, what are these cognitive skills that I keep talking about and that I'm sure we are all seeing and hearing more about in our daily lives? What do we mean when we say we'll build better readers and better learners by embedding cognitive skill development into reading skill instruction? So, in order to understand what cognitive skills are, I'm going to take you through a quick journey through the mud today. I would like for you to read this word on the screen and take a moment to consider all the things your brain just did in order to read that word. In the chat, I'd like you to list all the things your brain did when you read that word. Anything that you are aware of doing when you read that word, throw it into the chat. Great, a lot of people go straight to actually picturing what mud is. Yep, sounded it out. Then pictured the word in order to access its meaning. Yep, read it letter by letter. Nice, might have looked at the vowel first and then read the whole word. Yeah, well put, Christine. In a nutshell, you're connecting these letters to the sounds that you know they make. Thanks, guys. All right, so we all did a number of different things when we looked at this word mud. Let's journey through the cognitive skills that we use when we read words like this. What's the first thing you have to do when I ask you to read this specific word on this specific slide? Well, you have to pay attention to it. Attending involves focusing on specific information, sustaining that focus, and ignoring distractions in order to carry out a task. And in this case, your brain is ignoring other words or objects around this word, like this big green splat, in order to attend and read that word that I asked you to focus on. Now that you've ignored all those distractions and honed in on the word, your brain can focus its attention more closely on the spatial orientation and other details of the letters, like several of you said in the chat. So you went straight to the letters and you identified them. If you can attend to the first letter, for instance, to check its spatial orientation, you can confirm that it's an M and not a W. Okay, so you've paid close attention to the word and to the shapes of the letters within it. You've even begun to recognize its letters. If they're part of your visual memory, you can recognize them instantly. You immediately know that's the letter M. You might instantly recognize its name, the letter M. If you learn this letter more recently, it might actually live in your working memory, which is the place where we keep information in mind over the short term while we're trying to integrate it or manipulate it as we work. In that case, you might need a nudge from a teacher or a friend to remind you of what this letter name is. This is M. And now that you've accessed your working memory or visual memory in order to identify this letter M, you can call upon your knowledge that each letter represents a sound, as tons of you mentioned in the chat. You connected the symbol you see to your phonemic awareness, which is that foundational reading skill that supports you in identifying the individual sounds in words. All right, so now you can call up the sound that this letter makes, and this requires you to use your memory again. We're getting into auditory memory. So you're tapping into that type of memory in order to recognize the letter symbol correspondence for this letter. If you just learned the sound that M makes, then that knowledge might be stored in your working memory again and hasn't yet been sent along the neural pathways and into your auditory memory drawer. If you learned this a while back, you are instantly accessing the sound symbol association for it. Whew, okay, so you've done it. Well, you've done it for the first letter of this word. And now you can use those same cognitive skills and foundational reading skills in order to decode the next two letters in the word. As you decode, you'll keep the letters that you already read in your working memory so that you can eventually put all three letters together in order to decode the full word. You'll also use your sequencing skills to track the order of sounds in this word. So that is a ton of cognitive work that you've just done to read this word. Now, for most of us here on this call, this word has long been stored in our long-term memory, and that is why we recognize it instantly on sight. We read the word mud. That's also why so many of our brains go immediately to accessing the meaning of this word and actually imagining a visual representation of mud. So you might be picturing, soft brown mud in your mind, because your mind immediately recognized this word. So this journey through the mud today just demonstrates that cognitive skills are fundamental to being able to execute on these foundational reading skills. And indeed, the research that we'll look a little more into today shows that these cognitive skills are essential to being able to learn in general, not just to this business of foundational reading. So the trouble is, and likely the reason many of us are gathered here today, many of our students never receive any direct acknowledgement of, let alone support to develop or apply these cognitive skills. We have an opportunity to address this need. Research clearly demonstrates that supporting cognitive abilities can enhance learning for all of us. So through applying the principles of learning that we know from cognitive science, we can support kids in using and even improving these cognitive skills to learn as successfully as possible. We're going to talk about the cognitive skills you see on my slide today. You'll often see these referred to as executive functions because they support cognitive processes that we need to be the executives of our own lives. So to learn, to work, and just to manage our lives on a day-to-day basis. If we have trouble with these executive functions, we might find it hard to focus, to follow directions, to handle our emotions, among a lot of other things. So let's take a closer look at these skills just so we all have a shared knowledge base before we journey into the rest of the presentation. First, we've got memory. There are a lot of different types of memory. We just talked a little bit about auditory and visual memory. Overall today, when I talk about memory, I'm talking about the ability to use both your working memory and your long-term memory to understand and retain information, both in the moment and over time. Then we have attention. This is the ability to focus on specific information, something we might be challenged with as some of us work from home or have to shift our work environments quite a bit due to the pandemic. So this is the ability to sustain focus and ignore distractions when carrying out a task. Whether you realized it or not, you were using attention in order to attend to that word mud with the color behind it and with other words on the slide. Next up, we have processing. That's the ability to really quickly interpret and integrate auditory and visual information. Simple example, this could mean interpreting a sound to identify a phoneme, or even integrating a set of lines and curves to recognize a letter or a number. Finally, we have sequencing. quite what it sounds like. This is the ability to track the order of things, like the sounds in a word or the words in a sentence, all the way up to the events in a story. So we're sequencing very small as well as very large and more abstract bits of information as we communicate and as we learn across our days. All right, so these cognitive skills enhance a student's ability to build academic skills like the ones you see on the right side of my slide. In this case today, we're talking about language and literacy skills. We could just as easily be talking about academic skills and concepts for other content areas, such as math or world languages. And that's because we know the cognition, the work of cognition, and these cognitive skills enhance learning across content areas. Now, these cognitive skills also play an important role in many social and emotional skills, such as self-regulation and motivation, like you see here. Supporting the whole child, as we all seek to do through our work, means attending to each of these categories of student needs and skills that you see on my screen. Applying insights from the learning sciences about the cognitive principles behind learning, it gives us a way to cut through the noise of myriad instructional models and strategies in order to select approaches and teacher moves that are going to help all students either build or compensate for cognitive skills that underlie successful learning. Okay, so what are some of those cognitive principles of learning? What's learning sciences saying? Cognitive science has identified 4 main success factors in learning. I'm going to take you through those now. And I have a number of recommendations I'll share at the end of the slide. These main success factors are taken from Stanislaus Dehaene's great most recent book called How We Learn, Why Brains Learn Better Than Any Machine for now. So I'll run you through some of those recommendations at the end of my presentation as well. All right, first factor up, a familiar one to us now, it's attention. Attention is the first condition for successful learning because it's the filter that we use to catch and direct all the information that is coming our way. Next up, active engagement. If we want to remember new information, we can't just passively listen to a teacher or to a friend or to a coworker. We have to ask questions, we have to make hypotheses, and we might even have to perform experiments, try things out in order to fully understand what it is we're learning. Nothing implants new knowledge in our brains and memory better than intellectual struggle. That struggle comes through engaging with content. Engagement also keeps up our attention, so it's a win-win on that front. The next factor that cognitive science has identified is crucial to learning is feedback. The most current neuroscience research we have available indicates that the brain makes predictions and then learns when feedback shows whether or not those predictions were correct. So this shows that making errors is truly essential to learning, so long as we understand what caused our errors. And this is why feedback is so important. It allows us to learn, hey, was that prediction we made about this content right or was it wrong? Oh, if it was wrong, now I have a chance to go back and correct my understanding. Finally, we have consolidation. So memorizing new information or acquiring new skills like we might do when we're practicing sight words with a student, that's a critical first step. But that knowledge has to be consolidated if it's going to be durable and used automatically, which is to say almost unconsciously over time. So yes, we've got to practice sight words constantly, put them on flashcards and drill ourselves to our students. But eventually that knowledge needs to be consolidated so that we can just identify those words automatically when we're reading. Otherwise, reading will be a very laborious chore. Over time, this means effort fades and transforms into routine, which frees up space in the brain to learn and do new things, the goal. Quick fun fact before we move on, and something important to know for yourself and for the kids that you work with, is sleep plays an essential role in this consolidation process. Neuroscientists and cognitive scientists are still trying to figure out exactly how, but research does suggest that memory consolidation takes place when we sleep through this strengthening of neural connections that forms our memories. Yet another good reason to try to get some sleep. Okay, so that's a quick overview of cognitive skills and some of the big principles that are coming to us from neuroscience and cognitive science. what I'd love to hear from you is, how do you feel about supporting these types of skills in your classroom or school, or another work context if you don't work in a classroom or a school? Additionally, you can think about and share what data or student information would you want to have to know how to support cognitive skills in your classroom or school. Go ahead and share a few words in the chat. Those questions are in the chat too, so you can read them if that's better for you. And we'll see, how do you feel about supporting these types of skills in your classroom? It's fine to say, well, I have no idea. Yeah, I'd love to figure out how. Seems like it would really support a lot of kids. Yeah, thanks for sharing. So time is a catch, right? We feel like, oh God, does this mean I have to add 20 new strategies to my life, or run professional development that asks teachers to add 20 new strategies to their lives? And that's, I want to keep that thought in mind, and talk about it more today, because much of how we can construct our instruction and bring strategies into the classroom to either help kids build or compensate for cognitive skills is really just a universal design strategy. And those are things that actually we can use to support all kids. So, but I agree, we need to work smarter, not harder, and make sure the choices we're making are going to be efficient and effective for most students while addressing those who need them most. All right. Thanks for sharing. So a couple of people are getting into thinking about reading instruction more specifically. Let's get into that. Let's review what we know about reading instruction so that we can make those connections between the research base for reading instruction and knowledge that we're gathering from learning sciences. First up, it's important to calibrate around what we mean by the science of reading. So this term encompasses over 5 decades of research in the States from multiple fields. And this scientific evidence base, though it's existed for decades in this country, this term science of reading, it's gained a lot of traction in the last few years, and that can potentially lead to misunderstandings or sort of a narrowed view on what the term applies to. So it encompasses work around the science or the research about reading processes, quite literally how we learn to read. That type of knowledge is typically coming to us from the neuroscience and cognitive science fields. It also, of course, includes the science of reading instruction. So this would be looking at instructional practices that support students in actually enacting those reading processes. That knowledge typically comes to us from schools of education and psychology. And then finally, this term does encompass, and hopefully will encompass much more, from the science of implementation. That's to say research that we see happening on the ground in schools and in districts, whether it's conducted by independent evaluators working under grants, whether it's conducted by schools of education working directly with practitioners. We need a lot more of that science in order to confirm that the instructional choices we're making are indeed engaging students in those reading processes and leading them to become effective readers. Overall, this body of knowledge teaches us these 3 things. It teaches us how we develop proficient reading and writing skills, why some of us struggle with developing those skills, and then how we, as people in the education field, can more effectively assess, teach, and improve student outcomes through preventing as well as intervening when we see reading difficulties emerge. I'm going to take us through a very just kind of quick review of the evidence base here, because I do want to make sure we have time to make those connections to the cognitive science working principles. So trip down memory lane here, many of us have been steeped in the findings of the National Reading Panel. In 2000, our Congress here in the United States mandated that a 14-person panel, which they called the National Reading Panel, examine what ended up being more than 100,000 studies from, again, across those 5 decades on how children learn to read, in order to determine the most effective evidence-based methods for teaching kids to read. Some notable findings you'll see on my screen here. The biggie, of course, is that a systematic approach to teaching phonics proved itself to be the most effective method for teaching beginning readers and led to measurable growth in reading comprehension. They also found and promoted the understanding that phonics must be taught explicitly rather than allowing students to discover sounds that letters make as they come across them, or sort of on an as-needed basis when you see that they struggle. Phonics works best when we just systematically and sequentially teach kids what the letters say and then ask them to apply that sound simple awareness to decode. They also uncovered that the best time to teach phonics was before a child learned to read by other means, so typically in very early elementary school. And that led us, of course, to what many of us know and use in our jobs, which is these 5 essential components of reading. Many researchers have focused on identifying the components that are essential to this process of reading, and there has been overwhelming consensus both before the National Reading Panel convened as well as since, that these components are arranged into the categories of phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So we see these words a lot, and they continue to prove themselves to be these essential components in reading instruction, which is to say the things we need to focus on to ensure that students are building the underlying phonemic awareness that leads to their ability to decode words, that leads to their ability to read fluently. All the while, we are needing to expose students to lots of content so that they can build the knowledge essential to build vocabulary and comprehend what they read. Okay, as the years have gone on, we've seen a national discussion and focus on evidence-based instruction in reading. That's really occurred through the media, through organizations that surround and impact our schools. I have a few on my screen there that have proven themselves to be really enduring across the last couple of years. And starting in 2018, on the left-hand side of my screen, we saw a journalist named Emily Hanford at American Public Media report on problematic approaches to reading instruction around the US, and that ignited widespread interest in just what this evidence base for reading instruction is. EdWeek followed up with their Getting Reading Right series, and that was in 2019. And that actually looked at the cognitive science behind how kids acquire foundational reading skills, with a focus on the earliest elementary readers. In 2020, the International Literacy Association published their brief emphasizing the importance of systematic and explicit phonics instruction. They made and then Ed Reports, which many of you may have seen this year, last year. That's a nonprofit organization that reviews K-12 instructional materials. And they published their evaluations of some really popular reading programs, Fountas and Pinnell and the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project, and found that those programs, due to their lack of that systematic phonics instruction, didn't meet their expectations for text quality or alignment to our foundational reading standards. All to say, we are shifting toward people across the country engaged in taking a more structured approach to how we teach students to read. The International Dyslexia Association, I find, has a really nice, they've sort of codified the research on reading instruction to name this approach. They call it structured literacy. This is the approach to reading instruction that we're going to continue to see from companies like Carnegie Learning, as well as I think most of the others out there. This is the approach that applies the evidence-based methods popularized by the National Reading Panel, and also reinforced by research in the decades since. And this is where teachers carefully structure these important reading skills and concepts and the sequence of instruction to facilitate kids' learning. So you'll see this approach and the language of systematic and explicit instruction a lot these days. Because of that, I'd like to take a couple moments to understand what those terms really mean. So you can see, first up, we have systematic. That means whatever program you're using, the material should follow the logical order of language, beginning with the most basic concepts. That's why we start with phonological awareness, helping students segment words into syllables, for instance, to ensure that they can hear syllables and words. Before we move on to phonemic awareness, supporting students in learning sounds that letters make and connecting those sounds to symbols, in this case, letters. And then moving them on to applying all that good sound symbol awareness to actually decode or sound out words. So we're looking for a really logical sequencing of teaching, moving from basic to more complex concepts and elements. That's first up. Next, this content, when we're teaching reading, it should be cumulative, which means each step should build on the previous one. We're not hopping around. We're not letting kids sort of learn things as they see them in print. We're really taking them through in a cumulative and, again, systematic way. This one's super important, something that I think is sort of life's work for many of us that work with kids, and that's this instruction needs to be diagnostic. So it needs to be based on continuous assessment of where students are. In a reading program, that means you might be checking a student's understanding of vowel sounds, and if any are unstable, you're working on those sounds today. You're not scooting the student along to consonants. We need to meet, much like the cognitive principles from learning science tell us, we need to meet that assessment with responsive feedback so students can know, oh, my understanding of that letter is incorrect. And they can create an accurate understanding for themselves. Finally, you'll see this word explicit a lot. This means instruction that really deliberately and directly teaches concepts. It doesn't assume that kids will naturally deduce concepts on their own. It's telling them. A says ah. TH together normally says it's giving really explicit information to the students. Of course, these elements of instruction work really well when we are teaching phonics. We're not always going to be explicit for students when we're wanting them to kind of explore and inquire about scientific concepts, right? These elements really apply to and enact that research base that we know from reading in particular. I've got a lot more information. Like I said, this is a high-level sort of look at this research. So I have a lot more information and links that you can click on to explore these elements of reading instruction. Those are in the notes in my slides, and you'll be able to access them after our time together today. Okay, so we know a lot about this structured, systematic approach to reading. It's important, though, to say that the vast majority of students benefit from this instruction. These decades of research have really indicated that, but this is an important conversation to continue having, particularly for many of us who may be shifting away from other instructional models, balanced literacy or other models that you may have learned. What's important to understand, and what I think this ladder of reading image does a really nice job of conveying, is that a structured and systematic phonics-based approach to teaching kids to read is going to serve the majority of students. There's only that very small sliver at the top of this ladder that seem to not need any sort of explicit instruction and will learn to read regardless of receiving instruction. For the rest of us, we're going to benefit from explicit instruction that teaches us those letter sounds, that helps us connect those sounds to letters, that helps us decode, and that gives us a lot of practice with building fluent reading. So you can see we've got about 10 to, the student population is really broken into thirds for the most part. Not quite exactly, but just to keep that in your head, it's helpful. We've got this 10 to 15% of students that do have dyslexia. Learning to read really fundamentally requires a very explicit approach to teaching them phonics. For a really large segment right here, 40 to 50% of kids, learning to read proficiently is going to require the same type of instruction for them. They might learn a little bit independently, but these are a lot of the kids that we see that just need a little explicit instruction, and then they're gonna take off. And then we've got that 35% at the top. Learning to read is going to be relatively easy for them. They're really going to fly through systematic instruction, and we can get them into fluent reading and into building their vocabularies and comprehension capabilities through a ton of engagement with books and connected text. Bottom line, the reason I like to share this ladder a lot is because it just shows, hey, we're not wasting anyone's time by using a systematic and explicit approach to teaching these reading skills. But here's the kicker, and something that I know the researcher Mark Seidenberg talks about quite a bit and that I want to reinforce today is let's not forget the end goal. And the end goal is to get kids reading. So our instruction exists to get students to that goal. We don't want to overemphasize explicit instruction at the risk of actually getting the kids to read books and read connected text. I really enjoy this quote from Mark Seidenberg: "There is no special award for being able to state 131 spelling rules. There is a special award for people who can read well. Their lives are simply going to be better for it." So we do want to provide that explicit instruction. A really good evidence-based program will provide it for students. We don't want to let kids sit in learning spelling rules, for instance, when we can indeed move them on. We need to help them apply all of these skills to get to that end goal, which is reading. It's important. I think, I was a reading specialist, and I know you can get really stuck in the details and just focus on drilling vowel sounds, for instance. It's really important sometimes to pull yourself out of those details and remember that end goal, because it really is the act of reading connected text that builds vocabulary. And ultimately, we need knowledge in order to comprehend what we read. Okay, so how do we ensure that instruction supports every student, not just in developing these reading skills, because we know the elements of instruction that will help kids do that, but actually applying those reading skills to learn? And what do we do for all those students that may be struggling with some of those cognitive skills like attention or processing? How do we ensure that they're accessing this really great evidence-based reading instruction? I have found in my work here as a director of curriculum and instruction that the learning sciences research helps me to answer these questions. It helps me to respond to learner variability with strategies that support kids in accessing that reading instruction so that they can become independent readers and learners. Like I said, it's really helped me to cut through the noise of a lot of those myriad strategies and practices to make decisions about those responsive moves I can embed into reading instruction in order to support students who are showing some difficulty with those cognitive skills. And this is really important. I'll read this quote to you. It's from Mark Seidenberg, who I mentioned. Another great book here, Language at the Speed of Sight. He's a cognitive neuroscientist. He says, "There is a profound disconnect between the science of reading and educational practice. Very little of what we've learned about reading as scientists has had any impact on what happens in schools because the cultures of science and education are so different." I think we're in a spot culturally where we're really motivated, and it's wonderful. We're motivated to make those more practical connections between science and education. That said, it is really easy to just talk and talk and talk about these evidence-based practices without actually talking about how we as practitioners and people who are working with other humans, teachers and students, can apply all of that really good science in our classrooms. That's where the work of implementation science comes in, and that's sort of where this conversation about applying cognitive skills comes in. So I'm going to illustrate to you how we're moving in the right direction here. I think we've probably all seen the simple view of reading. This was an incredibly effective theory put forth by Gow and Tunmer. But in 1986, several decades ago, it's really helped to pave the way for what we know about effective reading instruction. This is a formula based on the widely accepted view that reading has these two basic components you see on your screen. We have word recognition, so that's that decoding ability, and language comprehension. That includes our receptive vocabulary, our grammatical understanding, our comprehension of dialogue. We need these two things in order to comprehend when we read printed language. So we know this, we've known this, we see this a lot, but we need to move forward with this, and we need to continue keeping our understandings of how we learn to read current. Thus, I present to you a really current a view sort of that expands on that simple view. This comes from the researchers Nell Duke and Kelly Cartwright, published earlier last year, 2021. They're calling this the active view of reading. You can see, I want to direct your eyes to that green circle on the left-hand side. This is really important. This demonstrates all of those cognitive skills, those self-regulation skills, like motivation and engagement, as well as all those executive function skills like memory and attention and processing. Those skills are drivers of the word recognition and language comprehension that we know goes into becoming an effective reader. We can't really have this conversation about teaching reading without attending, as so many of us know, to motivation, engagement, and these executive functions. I find this to be a really effective model to sort of show how we need all of that. It's really driving our ability to attend to and learned sound symbol associations so we can apply them to decoding. Really nicely, this conversation for another day, but for those of you that may be interested in bringing this into your own work spheres, that bridging processes overlap in the Venn diagram is really important. I think that really can help us to understand how the categories of word recognition and language comprehension, they're not separate. And in fact, we have some really specific processes like building vocabulary, like working on fluency, that are where we bring word recognition and language comprehension together. This paper is linked in the notes for this slide, and it's actually open access. I completely encourage you to read it. In fact, I'll put it in the chat here. I think it's a really important one if you'd like to read or bring it to your colleagues. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about current models in reading instruction. We know that research from education, from neuroscience, and from cognitive science is pointing to the executive functions and the self-regulation factors that drive our ability not just to read but to learn. So okay, that's all nice. What does it look like in practice? We can use learning sciences to select responsive teaching strategies that help kids to compensate for or apply their cognitive skills. And actually, before I get into this, one more note here is this looks a little different based on our ability to apply learning sciences, looks a little different based on our roles. For people like me who are more in curriculum and instruction design roles right now, this means we have the opportunity to embed scaffolds and strategies into our curriculum that support these self-regulation factors that contribute to reading. If you're an educator, an interventionist, or an administrator, and you're working directly with teachers and students right now, you can focus more on making observations of students to see when they're having challenges with these self-regulation factors. And in that way, you can respond to those observations that you're seeing. This is that way we can not just provide that great evidence-based reading program to our students, but actually make sure that those kids that are demonstrating some struggle are actually being helped, either in compensating for a weaker cognitive skill or actually enhancing it. So what does that look like in practice? Here's an attempt for you. It's a sort of a way we're moving forward here at Carnegie too, and that is to think about how we can use learning sciences to select these responsive teaching strategies for students. And this way we can respond to the variability of students in order to help them succeed in learning to read. So here's an example I have for you. We've got sight recognition, and that's the ability to know a word by sight rather than needing to break it apart into its letters and connect those letters to the sounds that they make. This skill improves reading fluency and efficiency. We really need it in order to become automatic with our reading. And the cognitive skill of long-term memory is what allows us to store sight words so we can access them while we read. So I have selected teacher moves or responsive strategies that actually support the development of or help kids compensate for a weakness in long-term memory. I'm actually using the cognitive skill to make selections about the teacher moves in the service of helping kids build sight recognition. This is a sort of a slightly new pathway. So instead of just choosing strategies that help a student build their sight word recognition, I'm actually making selections first that help a student with long-term memory. And that's in the service of building this sight word recognition. So an example here, I've got a couple classroom look-fors. If I see a student's distracting himself or others during sight word practice, if I see when we're doing when we're reading connected text that this student is just routinely struggling to recognize sight words as they read, they might be turning away from our fluency practice or showing a lot of behaviors when that activity comes up. Here are some moves I can make that will support the student in developing the sight word recognition. but through really helping focus on developing long-term memory. These are things a lot of us do, but we can bring attention to when and why we should use these moves. And in this case, we know long-term memory supports sight recognition. So I'm going to make decisions about the strategies I use so that they support long-term memory. In this case, we can create visuals, we can actually act things out, and we can play games. These are all ways to activate the cognitive processes for retaining information, engaging with the information, and recalling it. Here's one more example that I just took from one of those social and emotional skills that we looked at before, just to show how we can use cognitive skills to think about attending to the whole child beyond the academic skill development. This skill here is following directions. It's the ability to attend to details and plan an appropriate sequence of steps in order to carry out verbal directions. We've got two cognitive skills working here to help us when we follow directions. The first is working memory, and the second is attention, our old friends. And these two cognitive skills really support us in focusing on remembering and carrying out instructions. Tons of look-fors can come up here. We might be observing for when students are distracted or talking a lot when we give directions. We might observe for when they shut down or show a lot of behaviors when we're overviewing a new assignment or giving directions for a new assignment. They might routinely submit incomplete work. So when we're seeing these things, we can respond with teacher moves that are designed to support or reinforce working memory and attention. Again, in the service of building that skill of following directions. Here we know we can do things like provide brief instructions with visuals and gestures. We can give a student a quick checklist that they might use on their own that lists the steps we want them to take. We can encourage them to talk through the directions themselves. What's really important to note is that these are moves that support those students that need it I'll back up. These are moves that support working memory and attention for those students who need it. But they're also moves that just support all students in learning more efficiently. So these are moves, these are moves that can help a student compensate for a challenge in working memory and attention. They're also moves that can just help all kids to apply working memory and attention in order to be even more efficient and effective in the classroom. So what I want to direct you to and have you think about is in your context, in your role, how you might be able to engage in some of this planning work with your colleagues. I really recommend and encourage, sitting with maybe it's an instructional team, for instance, and identifying those skills like following directions, like sight recognition, whatever it might be, that you're seeing a lot of kids are struggling with on your campus. Identify the look-fors that are going to clue you in to when the student is struggling with that skill, and use cognitive skills as a way to help you, again, cut through the noise and make decisions about the strategies that are going to help build the cognitive skills that underlie whatever that academic or that social and emotional skill is that you care about or that you want to attend to. And I'm going to give you two great tools to start with in order to do that kind of work in your setting. The first comes from our friends at Digital Promise. They have an incredibly wonderful open resource available to any of us to use that they're calling their Learner Variability Navigator. I'll pull it up on the screen here just to model it for you. I'll just head into the literacy navigator here. Make this a bit bigger for you to see. Let's carry out that example. Let's say you're meeting with your colleagues. You're seeing the majority of your students are struggling pretty mightily with phonological awareness earlier on in your reading journey together. What's really wonderful about the model that the folks at Digital Promise have created, and that this has been through synthesizing and applying a wealth of research, is that it immediately shows you those cognitive factors that underlie and support phonological awareness development. Here we have auditory processing and short-term memory. So what I'm able to do is first head into the phonological awareness category, make sure I'm really clear on what this skill is. But I can also seek out strategies that are going to help me do two things, not just build phonological awareness, because there are about 1,000,001 ways we know how to do that, right? We're creative people. We have lots of strategies. Look at all these strategies to build phonological awareness. But I also know that short-term memory is a contributor to phonological awareness. I also know auditory processing is a contributor to phonological awareness. So I can select these two cognitive skills, get a much shorter list of strategies that help me support the kids in developing or using those cognitive skills so that they can become more successful with phonological awareness. So my point stands, these cognitive skills can really help us cut through a lot of different great strategies we might have in order to make decisions about the ones that are not only going to help the students build that reading skill, but are actually going to support the student in developing or applying the cognitive skills that underlie the reading skill. One other resource here comes from the organization Deans for Impact. This is a great one to use if you are in a school setting. They've got some really lovely overviews of learning sciences and of the principles behind cognitive principles, behind learning. These would make for really good professional development in reading, whether you're in a school or a district setting, or even an organization that supports schools. I've got an example from that resource on my slide here, but you can see they've really done a nice job of, again, condensing, synthesizing a lot of really great research from the learning sciences and providing practical implications or moves that you can make in the classroom. So those are two resources I encourage you to use, again, to think about not just the academic skill we care about, sight recognition, for instance, but to take a closer look under the hood and see, oh, what are those cognitive skills that support us in developing sight recognition? Let me make choices about the strategies I use based on those cognitive skills. That's actually just going to help all the kids more. It's going to help me get to those kids who are struggling with these skills, and it's actually going to help the kids who don't need to compensate for weak skills to soar that much more, move that much more quickly through the instruction. So I've got some recommended resources here on the slides. You'll see when you get these. These are linked. You can take a closer look at them. Another great book that I've referenced quite a bit throughout this webinar is How We Learn from Dehane. That's where those 4 pillars of learning come from: attention, engagement, feedback, and consolidation. And if you are needing and looking for an overview of all that good science of reading information, evidence-based behind reading instruction, I encourage you to check out the Reading League. They do a really nice job, again, of synthesizing and providing information on reading instruction, direct instruction, in really nice and again, just consolidated, simple ways that we can all understand and use in our jobs. So that's the overview today, my friends. I hope this has given you some food for thought around how we can really use a focus on cognitive skills to support students in developing reading skills. I really appreciate your time.